Welcome. This is the first episode of my new podcast, Stories Upon Stories with Jake Denton. This is my library. I live here in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'm a surfer and I'm a writer. I practice law now, but I've always been a writer. And before I was a lawyer, I was a journalist. Before I was a journalist, I was a traveling writer, surfer guy. After UVA, instead of getting a job like all my friends, I went surfing and writing and traveling. And I love stories, and I like to tell stories too. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a lot of the stuff that I wrote over the years, some of my favorite pieces or parts of them, and talk about them and how I wrote them and where I was when I wrote them. And we're going to start with this one, An American in Hanoi. I wrote this about my visit to the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam, where my grandfather was a prisoner of war. That was in 1999. I was 23 years old. I was over there for 9 months, traveling around in a backpack. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to read some of it. An American in Hanoi by Jake Denton, Hanoi, Vietnam. I had always wanted to visit Vietnam, and I always knew that when I did, it would be with great emotion. In 1965, my grandfather, retired Rear Admiral Jeremiah Denton, was shot down in his Navy jet during a bombing raid over North Vietnam. He would endure the next 7 years of his life and 7 months as a prisoner of war. For 4 of those years, he was held in solitary confinement, and he was brutally tortured throughout his stay. When the American POWs were sent home from Hanoi in 1973, my grandfather, as the ranking officer held captive for the longest time, was the first prisoner to get off the plane. Upon sighting the American flag, he disregarded his pre-written speech and said,
"We are honored to have the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America." God bless America.
This nationally televised return to freedom made him famous. He would later write, When Hell Was in Session, a book documenting the story of his internment, and serve 1 term as a U.S. Senator from Alabama. Throughout my life, I have considered my grandfather a hero, and he was on my mind as I arrived in Hanoi last October. I thought of him and of my father, who had signed up for the Army after his best friend was killed in action, and of all the other Americans who were affected by the Vietnam War. I was impressed by the different set of circumstances that brought us to this beautiful, tragic country. During my days in Hanoi, my mind would spin with sudden thoughts as I pondered my familial and national connections to this historic city. Today, Hanoi is alive and bustling. Walking through the old quarter, one stops and starts, dodging 2-wheeled traffic and pushing through crowds of pedestrians, streets of vendors, and foreigners. Women hawk produce from the curbside, baskets of fruit and vegetables slung over their shoulders on bamboo poles. Bicycles and motorcycles race through the narrow streets. Silk shops and internet cafes compete side by side for tourist dollars. There are not many cars, and I reckon it must be one of the busiest cities in the world without a McDonald's. The architecture is colonial. None of the buildings stand more than a few stories tall, and drooping green trees cover the streets in shade, while restaurant tables spill out onto the crowded sidewalks. Hanoi is a gorgeous city. From my first minutes in Hanoi, I knew that it was a place I would love, were it any other city in the world, one not haunted by the ghost of my grandfather's horrible experience. But a strange feeling, perhaps best described as guilt, immediately set in. Throughout my stay, whenever I was having fun, I would automatically feel self-conscious about it, saying to myself, how can you have fun in this place? And conversely, whenever I felt like complaining, I would check myself with the don't you dare complain here. After arriving in Hanoi that afternoon, I checked my email and these feelings were reinforced as I read a message from my father. He wrote that he was moved by my trip to Vietnam, asking me to take pictures and write home about my experiences. He finished his letter with the sentence, "That place is in our blood." And I sat staring at the computer screen, reading the words over and over. Evening times in Hanoi were difficult for me. I was traveling with a friend, and at night he wanted to explore the city's bars. While I was not in the mood for partying, I felt obliged to have a drink with him. I met an American from Boulder, Colorado, who was on his way to a Halloween costume party. He invited me to go with him, and when I asked him where the party was being held, he answered, at the Hanoi Towers Hotel. I realized that this was the hotel that had been built on the site of the French prison, the Hanoi Hilton, where my grandfather had spent so much time. "No, thank you," I said. I did not want to go to a Halloween party at the Hanoi Towers. I had not realized we were so close to the former prison camp. The next day, I visited the part of the Hanoi Hilton that had been turned into a hotel. As I walked toward the prison, a feeling of dread built up inside me. I knew that the horrible place I was about to see would bring unbearable images from my grandfather's book to life. I walked alongside the yellow prison walls, looking up at the jagged glass and rusted coils of barbed wire, and a feeling of numbness came over me. The museum was almost entirely dedicated to the French colonial period, during which Vietnamese political prisoners endured similar hardships to those that the communists would later inflict upon the Americans. Only a small portion of the original prison had survived the construction of the Hanoi Towers Hotel. The exterior and most of the inside had been refurbished. The newly cleaned cobblestone walls and the fresh yellow paint gave the place a distinctly false feeling. The exhibits focusing on Vietnamese prisoners' resistant movements included artist renditions of gaunt figures in shackles, glass display cases filled with torture devices, and the old French guillotine. They had a guillotine in there. It was heavy. When we were there, like I'm saying in the story, they didn't talk much about what happened to the Americans there. There was one room full of some BS propaganda about John McCain and a couple others. It was easy to imagine my grandfather as one of the wretched mannequins lying in agony, held to the concrete floor by a pair of rusty leg irons, and I walked from one display to the next, trying to take it all in. For me, the most disturbing parts of the prison were its physical manifestations. Impossibly small windows, covered in layers of iron grating, heavy rusted doors that seemed designed never to open, and the cells themselves. The cells seemed like something from a nightmare. They were small, dark, and solid concrete, the beds designated only by a rusted pair of leg irons bolted into the cement. I shuddered to think that these were among the most humane of the various horrific cells the American POWs had been held in. As I walked between buildings, I noticed a closed room, and as I peered through the dusty window, I saw a large pile of rusted leg irons. This was an honest representation of the prison's past, and I couldn't help wondering when the shackles had last been used. One room toward the back of the prison was dedicated to the American pilots who had been held captive. The Vietnamese have not acknowledged the war crimes committed against the POWs, and the display falsely represented how the Americans had been treated. A sign read, "A few pictures of American pilots in Ho Lo Prison," and the photographs of prisoners receiving presents and letters, cooking a Thanksgiving dinner, and meeting with journalists were accompanied with, in addition to the pictures, a freestanding bed with a mat, a brand new looking tennis shoes, a volleyball net, a blanket, a mosquito net, and a towel were displayed as evidence of the good life the American prisoners had had. While I had come to expect propaganda from the Vietnamese, the new shoes and volleyball net were hard to take. The reality had been that the prisoners were virtually starved to death for long periods of time. At one point, a guard taunted my grandfather to eat his meager food soup. "You are eating shit, Denton." The feces floating in the broth were the only thing keeping him alive. During the winter months, they were given neither adequate shelter nor clothes to protect against the cold. 12 of the most uncooperative prisoners were held for 2 years in the infamous Alcatraz camp, where the cells were not large enough for a man to stand in. One of the 12 did not survive. In addition to wretched living conditions, the POWs were badly tortured. Many of them were routinely kept in leg irons for months at a time as punishment for alleged poor behavior. Refusal to cooperate during interrogations could also result in serious torture sessions that often lasted for days. There were different torture routines, typically involving a psychological preparation period followed by a physical pain period. For example, on one occasion, my grandfather was deprived of sleep, food, and light for 4 days. Afterwards, he was tortured with ropes for 4-hour sessions, breaks coming only with the loss of consciousness. When he refused to submit to the guards' demands, they became frustrated and rolled an iron bar across his shins, each of them jumping on either end while he lay on the ground helplessly contorted by the ropes. After I left the prison, I went to the internet cafe to write home about what I had seen. The images from my visit to the prison were brought to life by the letters waiting for me from home. Coincidentally, the Tom Hanks-sponsored documentary film about American POWs in Vietnam, Return to Honor, had just been released in my father's hometown. My father had written my grandfather an email describing his reaction from the film, My grandfather had responded, and they had both sent copies of their messages to me. My dad wrote that ever since the day my grandfather came home from prison and described to his children what he had been through, he had suppressed a secret desire to experience the rope torture. As I sat reading these words in an internet cafe, I understood what my father was trying to express. It reminded me of the feelings I had been having in Hanoi. The thought of a loved one enduring torture with courage seemed to inspire a fantastic urge to somehow share both the agony and the pride of the ordeal. At the same time, both my father and I realized that these ideas belittled the experience, and no one would bring the pain of torture upon himself. My grandfather clarified this in his reply. He first described the normal rope trick, which took 4 hours to unconsciousness if the ropes were tied right. Another of the torture methods, which he experienced 3 times, worked the same, but, quote, had a feature by which when you passed out, a pole was forced out when you fell over, releasing the pressure from the ropes and causing blood to flow back into your veins, more painful than when the veins are starved of blood, and of course, you regained consciousness. Then, when that ran its course, they put you back in the rig, and you went about 4 hours more, etc. 4 doses of 4 hours each was enough to rob you of any sense except the knowledge of pain and wanting out of it, end quote. He also described the punishment for his behavior during an interview with the Japanese press. Although the Vietnamese did not realize my grandfather blinked the letters T-O-R-T-U-R-E, torture, into the bright camera lights, giving the United States government the first concrete evidence that captured Americans were being tortured. They were infuriated. And my grandfather talked about this a lot, and everyone in our family that heard him talk about it knows it's important, that he knew he was going to be tortured for what he said. It wasn't just about what he blinked. My grandfather and all of us are so proud of him for what he said, because what he said while he was blinking torture, and he knew what was going to happen to him, was the following. The Vietnamese were infuriated by his internationally televised statement. Rather than cooperate with his captors by denouncing the American bombing of North Vietnam, my grandfather, appearing weak and badly beaten on camera, said,
"Well, I don't know what is happening, but whatever the position of my government is, I support it fully. Well, whatever the position of my government is, I believe in it. Yes, sir. I am a member of that government, and it is my job to support it, and I will as long as I live."
Soon afterwards, my grandmother received a letter from President Lyndon Johnson. He wrote, "I wish to share with you and your 7 children sincere pride and the courageous statement made by Commander Denton of support for us and for our policy in Vietnam. It has given me renewed strength." My grandfather emailed my dad that his pro-America statement had resulted in a torture session that was, quote, "the worst experience I have ever had, and only the rosary preserved my sanity," end quote. Finally, my grandfather assured my father that none of the rigs would you or anyone else want to endure for any reason. After visiting the Hanoi Hilton and reading my family correspondence, I found myself reminiscing about a childhood trip to my grandparents' home in Alabama. I was enjoying the visit. I liked it when my granddad showed me his medals or played chess with me. There's a little bit more to that story. So while my grandfather was in prison, my dad volunteered to go to Vietnam as a helicopter pilot. And he's a lifelong aviator. He loves flying fixed-wing planes. He's loved his whole life. We flew to Alabama when I was 10 years old. When my dad woke me up one night and told me we were leaving because he and his father had had a fight. And they got in a screaming argument, my father and grandfather, in the middle of the night, woke us up. We got dragged out of the house, put onto this Cessna airplane. The flight home, I was reading When Hell's in Session, my grandfather's book, and I was taking my mind off the horrific thunderstorms we were flying through on this Cessna airplane. My dad has said many times we never should have done that, and that is facts because we were bouncing around in that turbulence like crazy. My dad and granddad, the point of the story is they never really could talk about politics, and if I'm not mistaken, for about a year after that incident, they didn't speak at all. And that is something that I have always remembered because I take pride in being able to talk to everybody about politics. Throughout my career and everything that I've done, I always try to think about things that my dad and my grandfather would agree about. Anything that my dad and granddad would agree about politically, I feel like all Americans would agree about. I call that the Jeremiah test. All right, so I'm going to keep reading. The next day, I went to Hanoi's Army Museum. The exhibits were well done, concentrating on Vietnam's war with France and America. Old tanks, airplanes, and missile launchers were on display outside the museum. One of the most moving exhibits paid tribute to Vietnam's mother of war, some of whom had lost 8 or 9 children. An outdoor monument, a type of collage made from downed American airplane scraps, also impressed me. I walked around the museum looking at the tools and pictures of death, the madness of war screaming through my head, and I felt like sitting down and crying. Later during my stay, I had a conversation with an elderly American couple. I told them that my grandfather had been held as a POW, and the woman asked me how I felt about my trip to Vietnam. I tried to explain my emotional reaction to the country, saying how strange it felt to be there as a tourist when 30 years ago my grandfather was enduring torture and people my age were dying. The man became defensive, talking to me in an accusing tone. But how can you feel that way? The Vietnamese people had bombs dropped on them and they have forgotten it. They say the past is the past. The implication that I resented the Vietnamese revealed how badly he misunderstood me. He seemed to be asking why I didn't forget the war, but I wondered why anybody would want to forget history. Every time I checked my email, there was a touching letter from my family. On my next trip to the internet cafe, I received a letter from my mother, speaking about how important Vietnam was to our family. She wrote, "I've never seen such emotional anguish from your dad as when he watched the fall of Saigon on the news. I could picture my father in front of the TV watching the last desperate helicopter pull away from the American embassy and pondering the sorrow, the pain, and the death of war. I found myself looking out the window and thinking similar thoughts as Hanoi's traffic blurred by. On my last night in Hanoi, I dreamed. I randomly came across a strange area of the city that appeared to be a prison, a labor camp, an air base, and a factory all in one. I asked an American man working on the grounds where I was. The prison, he said. What prison, I asked. The old Hanoi Hilton. A squadron of Vietnamese fighter jets flew overhead, practicing highly acrobatic maneuvers. I was watching the formation flying with an American woman. Somehow the surreal prison complex was staffed with Americans. When suddenly, 4 large, bald eagles appeared in the sky. They soared magnificently and flew very close. I marveled at the birds and thought how big and beautiful they were. Suddenly the American woman looked at me and said, "Are you a Denton?" "Yes," I said. The lady began to gush about my grandfather. She said that during the war she had worked in the prisoner's mailroom and that she remembered him well. She spoke of his courage and told me how proud I should be of him. While she talked, a bald eagle circled towards us. Its wings spread tremendously. The bird captivated the woman and me. We became silent as it settled on the ground at our feet. The eagle held its white head erect with pride, its round eyes darting from us to the warplanes in the background. I awoke with the American symbol fresh in my mind. I sat in the hotel thinking about where I was and where I came from, and the two countries' tangled histories. As an American in Hanoi, I had wrestled with the tragic legacy of my countrymen, trying to make sense of history, war, and heritage. I remembered my father's comment, "That place is in our blood," and I hoped that my experience in Vietnam had brought me closer to realizing the significance of that statement. Kind of a soft ending there. I think I made that dream up kind of to fit the story when I was writing it. I think I was doing my creative writing vibe. That's how I'd like to write that then, apparently. This was the first cover story I ever published. You see, Portfolio Weekly, that was our alternative weekly. This story was important to me for so many reasons because I was so into writing at the time, and I was thrilled that they just let me write it that way, the way that I wanted to write it. They published it in our hometown where a lot of people knew my granddad and know our family, and that was awesome. I just want to say a few more things about my grandfather. Like I said, I lived with him during law school, and we became even closer than we already were because I'd already lived with him in Alabama. He passed away right after my son, Jeremiah Andrew Denton V, was born about 12 years ago, and my other children, Patrick and Summer. This is his book, but I want to show you this. Best picture ever. Grandma Jane and my grandfather. It says Admiral Denton greeting his wife Jane after his return to freedom. That's when they first saw each other. These two people loved each other so fierce and strong you've never seen anything like it in your life. They were like that all the time, not just when he got off the plane coming back from prison too. I remember a really cute story. They were like, just getting so sensitive with each other. I just want to spend time with you. I've recommended this to friends over the years, and I recommend it to anyone watching this, because if you read this and you like good stories, it's one of the most compelling ones out there. It's almost impossible to put this book down when you start reading it, in my opinion. Their sacrifice and everything they did, and everyone that's involved in public service and in our military day in and day out. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for the first episode of our podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any good ideas, send me your favorite stories. Stories upon Stories with Jake Denton. Over and out.